Greetings and thank you for tuning in to Walking in Wealth. I'm your host, JD Garnier, and you are listening to KKNO K75 AM on 107.1 FM radio in New Orleans, or you tuned into the Melanomics podcast. I hope you had a productive week in your wealth creation journey. And listen, my goal is simple: to help you walk in wealth, mentally, physically, spiritually, and financially. To take the things that God has already given you and use those to create a life of purpose, so that wealth is more than just what you acquire. Wealth is who you become. You are the wealth, not your investments, not your real estate, not your business. You are the wealth. And before you have any of those things, you have a unique and specific set of talents, abilities, gifts, ideas, habits, disciplines, and inclinations that form the basis of everything that you do in this world. And once you tap into that, you start your wealth creation journey. So again, you are the wealth. Listen, first things first, if you're not following me on social media, please follow me on Instagram at GarnierJD, Facebook at JD Garnier Senior, and please subscribe, like, and share the Melanomics YouTube channel. You can also download audio of my podcast by subscribing to Melanomics on iTunes and Spotify. If you are in the New Orleans area, you can catch my radio show every Monday and Wednesday at 8 o'clock and 10 o'clock a.m. on KKNO K75 AM or 107.1 FM radio in New Orleans. If you would like to contact me about topics that I discuss on the show, you can email me directly at jd@jdgarnier.com. That is jd@jdgarnier.com. I do not provide investment, tax, or legal advice or make any recommendations to any products or services. All investments involve risk, and I advise that you meet with or consult with a professional before making any financial decisions. If you would like to consult with me in that capacity, please schedule an appointment through my website by searching JD Garnier, Merrill Lynch, Woodlands, Texas. Now listen. This show is all things wealth. The topics I discuss, whether social, business, or economic, are all in the context of how it relates to wealth and how we can advance the economic interests of the Black community. We have a mission to close the racial wealth gap. Most economists and experts believe that it could take centuries, but I believe that we can close the wealth gap in one generation. Once you come to the undeniable conclusion and indisputable fact that you are the wealth. Now listen, we have a lot to talk about today. There is a lot to talk about. I was very fortunate recently to be invited to Washington, D.C. On behalf of an organization that I'm not affiliated with, but some of my close colleagues and friends are. And they invited me there to share my perspective, having been in financial services for almost 25 years, to share my perspective on how we can close the wealth gap. And so I had the opportunity to speak at the White House in front of over 60 extremely successful gentlemen from around the country, including people from the White House administration, on my thoughts about what we need to be doing as a country to close the racial wealth gap. I was extremely honored to do it, but it was also very refreshing for me to see so many other like-minded men like myself from all over the country that share my sentiment, share my ideas, share my passions about how we can improve the circumstances in our community. And so, you know, for those of you who feel hopeless, who don't have a whole lot of hope, I would say that they have a lot of extremely intelligent, extremely successful, extremely passionate people working behind the scenes on our behalf. And I was very pleased and proud and humbled to be a part of that conversation and discussion. And I'll certainly share more details about that in the future. But one of the things that resulted from that conversation is that it just got me thinking. And I mean, I think we all know, right, a lot of how we got here in terms of our economic circumstances, but it really, really got me thinking about how we got here. Like how we got in this position where we are currently, and how do we get out of it? How do we change it? What is the thing, the immediate, the most important thing that needs to change to get us out of it? And so that has been at the core of my thinking just since I left. It's all I can think about. And, you know, this is what I believe. Everything has a trade-off, right? And the most significant legislation as it relates to race in our lifetime is probably the Civil Rights Bill. And historically, when we look back, that's something that we were able to achieve. But everything has a trade-off. Because if you look economically at what has happened to our community since then, the decline has been extremely rapid. And so you have to ask, what is at the core of that trade-off? What changed? Right? And what needs to change to put us back on course? And some of you, you know, I don't know necessarily, my listener base is wide range, right? And so my older listeners can understand when I talk about the shift in generations. But some of the younger people that listen to me, you may not remember a time, right, when our generation just had an understanding of togetherness, right? When you lived in a neighborhood and everybody in the neighborhood knew one another, right? And the older people in the neighborhood would look out for one another's kids, and you can go up and down the block, and, you know, it was just different, right? The neighborhoods were just different. The way that we interacted with one another was just different when I was growing up, right? It was really more of a community. And that's something that we've traded to become consumers. Because essentially what the Civil Rights Act gave us was the ability to now consume, to freely consume, right? At first, we couldn't eat at certain restaurants. We couldn't shop at certain places. We couldn't educate ourselves at certain schools. We were excluded from their economy. And so we built our own economy. And so what that change did was then open us up to become consumers in their economy. And so we traded our community for consumption. And so over the course of decades, right? Because if you think about it chronologically, right after, and this was done very methodically, but this is all documented. It's all documented, right? It's all documented. Um, but I want to focus on the economics of it. I want to focus on the economics of it. So right after the civil rights movement, right, and we get to the 70s. The 70s was an era of the kind of the beginning of the computer age and the ending of the industrial age, right? And so we come into the 70s, and what starts to happen is now we are integrated. We can work with them, we can shop with them, we can do all of these things. Well, now the factories that employed all of us in the inner cities, those factories start to close down. And so there's a phenomenon called white flight. Now, this is something that I did my law school thesis on. I did an entire 30, 40 page paper about this topic. But the theory is, in predominantly white neighborhoods, once the percentage of Black or African Americans gets above a certain percent, like they're okay with one or two families in a large neighborhood, that's no problem. But once the Black percentage gets above a certain percentage in any neighborhood, what starts to happen is the phenomenon called white flight, where white people start to then sell their homes and move to other areas. And this has been studied, right? You can look this up. And so that percentage was right around between 8 and 10%, or 7 and 10%. Once you start to get above 10% in any one neighborhood, that starts to happen. And so during the 70s, this is what, as we were able to integrate into neighborhoods, the first place we started was still within the city. And so if you go back in any major metropolitan city, and there were times in the 60s where certain areas, this was the Black area, period. And then what started to happen was we integrated into other areas, and you can go and ask your parents or your grandparents, and they'll tell you. Those areas used to be all white neighborhoods. But then as we started to move and migrate there, white people started to move to the suburbs. And so we then moved to those areas. And so that's when a lot of neighborhoods, you got like the east side and the west side, or the north side and the south side, is because at first we were all together. We were all in one place back in the day, right? But then as we were able to integrate, then percentages of us started to take over these other neighborhoods, and then we eventually just consumed them, and now we're on both sides, right? But we all started in the same place. And so now you have these different neighborhoods, and now they, for whatever reason, they rivalry, but at the same time, white people are moving to the suburbs. But what's also happening is the jobs are moving to the suburbs, because we're going from these major factories and vehicle plants and all of these refineries and things that employed people in the inner cities. The warehouse districts and in almost every major city turned into nothing. That's because the jobs moved to the suburbs, right? The Microsofts, the computer labs. That's what happened. And so then we were isolated. And so this is where you start to see huge populations of unemployed men, Black men. And so if you look in the 70s, unemployment was through the roof, especially for Black men. We could not find jobs. And so this is when the welfare system starts to kick in, right? And it economically disadvantaged us. It's not that we didn't want to work, but the job that had employed our dads at the factory, and he worked for the plant for 25, 30, 40 years, those jobs were starting to dry up. And we couldn't work there anymore. And we didn't have college degrees at the time because they just started allowing us to go to college. We weren't even doing that. And so this disadvantaged us economically. The only thing we had during that time was land. And in a computer age, land is useless from a perception perspective. And so what started to happen then is we started to sell family land. At one point in time, as a community, we own more than 16 million acres of land in this country. And over the years, over the generations, we've sold that land. And so we depleted our assets, right, to make up for the income gap because we were not able to earn the incomes. And so the 70s was a very difficult time. You go look back at cities at New York and Chicago and Los Angeles in the Black community. This is when gangs really started to form, right? This is when gangs started to form. It was a very impoverished time. And so you get into the 80s, and then what happens? Right? You already have crime, you already have poverty, you already have drugs. And then the 80s and crack cocaine happens, right? And we already know this is something that was purposely done to our community. This is all documented, right? We all, Iran Contra, right? We all understand that these things were done to infiltrate. But the point is, chronologically, as we are facing this massive unemployment, as we are trying to adjust to this new economy that we don't know anything about, right? And we're suffering the most for it, right? And then what happens? You suffer in the home, right? As we're, fighting in the Vietnam War and all of these other things that were going on at the time, right? These things were economically disadvantaging us already. And then bam, crack cocaine hits our community. And it is just like a 100-pound weight, on somebody who's already struggling to get up, right? And so in the late 1960s, our two-parent households in our community was over 80%. And so all of these things that I'm talking about started to devalue the essence of the home, right? It started to devalue because now, it is dividing us. It is dividing us. You have, men that cannot find employment, women that are in need of security, right? And it's just dividing us. And so we go from 80% in the 1960s, pre-civil rights, two-parent homes, slowly, decade after decade, down to now, it's barely over 20% of our households our children grow up in two-parent households. And so you can't tell me that that's not a direct correlation with the decline of the value system in our community. It's in direct correlation to it. And so all of these things are happening year over year over year, right? The 80s happened, crack cocaine, that destroyed, and then that increases the violence, right? What happens when violence occurs in communities? People are scared. People want protection. People want safety. Then the 90s happened. And that's when they passed a crime bill to appease us. Say we're gonna take out the worst in the neighborhood, right? We're gonna take out the crack dealers. We're gonna take out, and they use that to take out everybody. And then the prison population from the early 90s up through the 2020s has quadrupled because of that, right? And so just hit after hit after hit, generation after generation has been focused on survival. And so for most of the people that are listening, you're probably the first generation that's in a position to actually think about building wealth. Think about that. If you're lucky, you're second generation. But for most of us, we're the first generation to really have the opportunity to think beyond survival. And so, in my mind, it's time to take advantage of that. but we have to understand how. And so again, as it stands today, white families control over 86% of the wealth in this country. Black families control less than 3% of the wealth in this country. The average net worth of a white family is about $186,000. The average net worth of a black family is about $17,000. And I can go on and on and on and on with numbers and statistics that explain to you how dire the situation is. So how do we change it? What does it start with? How do we make up all that ground to close the gap? How do we do it? Well, the question is, how do you control an entire group of people? How do you ensure that the majority of that group follows the same path or makes the same choices as the next, ultimately controlling the outcome? How do you construct a mindset? Today, I want to talk about ideas. You know, the art of war, the very first thing that it says is that all war is based on deception. That's the very first sentence in the art of war. All war is based on deception. Think about that. And so when we look at our circumstances and we know the things that have been done to us, we understand historically, we have to ask ourselves, how are we being deceived? How? Today, I want to talk about ideas. Everything that exists started as an idea. We all know that. Every single object on the earth, every singular idea in somebody's mind, the wheel, the airplane, the iPhone, the metaverse, all of those things started in somebody's mind. Think about that. The stuff that we use every day, it started out as a concept in somebody's mind, and now it is a reality. So what is an idea? Well, the dictionary defines an idea as an entity, such as a thought, concept, sensation, or image, actually or potentially present to consciousness. So based on this definition, the moment you form an idea, it exists in the universe separate and apart from yourself. An idea is its own entity. So whether you act on it or not, an idea exists in the universe. Think about what I'm saying. The moment you have an idea, The moment it happens, it exists separate and apart from yourself in the universe. If it exists, it has the ability to become a reality. How many ideas do you think have ever existed? The number is infinite. It's infinite. When you come up with an idea, what happens is that your brain takes in tiny seeds of information and they're planted into the subconscious. It could be a new experience, a concept in a book, a YouTube video, a conversation, whatever the stimulation is. Any number of conscious experiences can spark the birth of a new idea. And what happens in your brain is that the clash between the neurons and the part of the brain that stores information that you already know and the neurons in the brain that are stimulated by outside influences creates something new. You have a new experience and it clashes with something in your mind that you already know. And it forms a new idea. Think about how powerful that is. One experience can create one idea that could change the entire world. Our ideas guide the decisions that we make in reality. And so how do new ideas come about? Through experiences, through environment, through interaction. Right? Every time you have an experience, you do something different, right? You go somewhere different. That stimulates the part of your brain, right? That's challenging what you already know. Your environment, everything around you has the opportunity or ability to stimulate ideas. Your interactions with people, conversations, right? Listening, using all of your senses, all of those things have the ability to stimulate new ideas. One idea made into reality can change the entire world. For the people in power, that's a problem. There's a reason why we were denied during slavery the right to be able to read. There's a reason why they didn't want us educated. Because if you can read, then you can conceive or conceive of thoughts. And the more you read and conceive of thoughts, the more ideas you have. And the more ideas you have, the more questions you have. And a man that has questions cannot be a slave. And so by limiting our knowledge and our ability to read, they limited our ideas. Think about the leader of North Korea, Kim Jong-un. He doesn't want any outside influences in his country. He wants no Western influence. If you are caught watching television, seeing anything that comes from the Western world, you can be killed. Because he understands that if any idea plants root in this country, it is a threat to my power. And so the only difference between him and other regimes is that he's upfront with it. But the same things are being done to us in terms of the control of our ideas. Listen, there's a reason to control ideas. As parents, we control the ideas of our children. That's why we protect them from inappropriate behavior. That's why we protect them from mature content, right? Because we don't want them exposed to any new ideas. Because one negative idea manifested in the mind of a child, you can't undo it, right? So that's how powerful ideas are. They have the ability to change the world. They can change the course of thought. They free your mind. But that's the same reason why our ideas have been controlled. How do they control ideas? By your environment. Your ideas are controlled by your environment. Do you think it is a coincidence that every ghetto, every hood, in every major city around the country looks virtually the same? Do you think that's by coincidence? If you can control the environment, and if every day our young people in every major city in the country are seeing blight, are seeing drugs, are seeing crime, are seeing alcohol, are seeing disrespect, if that's all they're seeing and they're all seeing it, then they're all going to start to think the same. That environment is going to control their ideas. They're not exposed to anything positive. They're not exposed to nature. They're not exposed to trees, to anything pleasant. That is going to control their train of thought. That's going to control their ideas. The other way that people control our ideas is through consumption. What we watch, what we consume every single day. You're on your phone every single day. We listening to, to murder music every single day. You think that does not control you, but what you consume controls your ideas. It controls your thoughts. If you are always listening to music that's disrespected women, in your mind, you are going to think disrespectfully. If you are always listening to music that's talking about conflict with other men that look like you, that's how you're going to treat and approach one another. Because it is controlling your ideas. Your senses control your ideas. All right, what you take in. Right, what you see, what you hear, what you smell, all of that stuff controls your ideas. So when you have the power to control the environment, you can control what people consume, you can control people's senses, you have the power to control an entire group of people. You have the ability to control how they think. And so if they all think the same, your job is done. But this is the thing. When you control those things, you limit the filter for which new ideas can come about. Controlling your ideas is the simplest and easiest way to control you. They don't have to force you to do anything. If they can control your ideas, they can control what you see, what you consume, your environment. They can control what you think about. Now you become your own enemy. So there's nothing that they even have to do. That's why all of our neighborhoods look the same. You can go to any hood in New Orleans, in Atlanta, in Houston, in LA, in Chicago, and they're going to look virtually the same, even though they're hundreds of miles apart from one another. It's because the way that we think is being controlled. And if you can limit the filter through which new ideas come about, then you essentially have rigged the game. See, this is the thing. We think that the system is this invisible thing that nobody can quantify. It's just built in. Nobody can really say exactly what it is, right? It's the system, it's systematic oppression, right? The criminal justice system. All a system is a controlled environment. A system is a controlled environment. That's it. You control the environment with laws, with regulation, right? With processes. That's how you control the environment, right? And all of those things which are built in creates a specific statistical set of outcomes. And so if they can control our environment, they control the things we see, they control what we consume, they control, right, where we exposed to every day, then statistically, without even having to do anything else, they can control the outcomes of what happens in our community. And so the question of the day is, how do you fight that? How do you fight the system? How do you change the system? How do you combat the system? And the answer is simpler than you think. The answer is you change your behaviors. You change your behaviors. You see, the system is depending on a specific set of behaviors by a certain percentage of people. And as long as you continue to fall into the continuous mindset and do the same things over and over and over and over again, then you are a victim of the system. But once you decide to change your behaviors, now you remove yourself from the system, because your behaviors are no longer controlled by your environment, because you can go where you want to go. Your behaviors are no longer controlled by what you consume, because you've decided to consume other things. Your behaviors are no longer controlled by these other things. You change your behaviors. Even if it's painful, you change your behaviors. And collectively, if we collectively change the behaviors in our community, we break the system, right? If we collectively change the behaviors in our community, right? As collectively, we start to spend differently. Collectively, we start to treat one another differently. Collectively, we start to do this differently. Collectively, we stop doing certain things. Collectively, if we change our behaviors, the entire system crumbles on itself, and we change our circumstances. That's how you change the system. But it starts with expanding our realm of ideas. That means we need to prioritize educating our children. That means we need to prioritize educating ourselves. Because we have to reset the standard. We have to reset the standard. We can't just depend on the education system to educate our children, right? They provide a service. We take advantage of that service. But ultimately, as parents, it is up to us to make sure that our children acquire a minimum standard of aptitude. That, as a community, should become our responsibility. If you are a parent, your ultimate contribution outside of anything monetarily to your children should be to get them to a minimum aptitude level in reading and in math. That is your contribution to your child. The majority of the children who commit crimes are the same children who have trouble in school. Many of those children cannot read. They cannot do math past the 4th or 5th grade level. That embarrassment produces anger. That anger obviously makes bad decisions. And then once we get our children into the teenage years, we lost them to the streets. But if we commit to making sure that our children, by the time they leave elementary school, have a minimum standard of aptitude, it's not that difficult. That'll change the trajectory and circumstances of our entire community. It's on us, though. If, as a community, we committed to saving 20% of our income collectively, we have over $1 trillion in spending power annually. So 20% of that is $200 billion. That's going towards putting back wealth into our own communities, right? Storing up wealth, changing our habits, shifting our consumer mindset. If we did that collectively, what would that do to the system? If we simply said, we are going to treat one another with love and respect, no matter what, and we started to interact with one another differently, what would that do? How would that resolve conflict? We have to change our collective way of thinking. Economics is the study of how people interact with value. The reason why this show is called Melanomics is because melanated people have a unique circumstance in this country as it relates to economics. And so in order for us to thrive in a capitalistic society, there was a certain way that we have to conduct ourselves and interact both amongst one another and with other groups of people to advance our economic interests. And that's what Melanomics is. It is the blueprint of how to create value for a group of people who have historically had their value taken. And how do they restore themselves in their economic interests in a country where they have been disadvantaged. And I think if we change our mindset, if we expand our ideas, and if we change our behaviors, that is the foundation of us changing our economic interests. So let's get to it. I'll see you next time.